The architecture of lies-manipulated intelligence is a deliberate governmental tool. It is the shaping or outright invention of information. This creates a false justification for military conflict. The public, often unsuspecting, is the primary target of this sophisticated deception. Truth, it is often said, becomes the very first casualty of war. This frequently occurs long before any shots are actually fired. Powerful, entrenched interests invariably benefit from these carefully constructed fabrications. Wars are not simply declared on the basis of unvarnished facts, they are meticulously sold to populations. This insidious pattern is a dark, recurring feature throughout modern history. Governments resort to such deceptive practices for several key reasons. Primarily, it is to overcome inherent public reluctance towards engaging in war. Another crucial aim is to effectively demonize a designated enemy, making them appear monstrous. Often, the goal is to secure vital strategic positions or economic resources abroad. In this process, democratic checks and balances are systematically subverted and ignored. The mainstream media frequently plays a complicit role, whether wittingly or unwittingly, amplifying the state's narrative. Disinformation campaigns grow increasingly sophisticated. They prey on nationalistic fear and patriotic fervor. The ultimate goal is to establish an unchallengeable singular narrative for war. The consequences of these deceptions are invariably devastating and far-reaching. Countless human lives are tragically lost, all based on false pretenses and fabricated justifications. Entire regions are destabilized, often for many generations to come, creating cycles of violence. Public trust in governmental institutions and official pronouncements erodes significantly, sometimes irreparably. The financial cost of these wars is astronomical, diverting essential resources from public services. International law is frequently violated with a disturbing sense of impunity. The architects of these grand deceptions very rarely face any genuine accountability for their actions. This failure to prosecute sets a deeply dangerous precedent for future conflicts. It is a stark betrayal of public faith. This essay will now proceed to examine specific, undeniable instances of this phenomenon. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, occurring in August 1964, stands as a classic, undeniable case study. The United States government, under President Lyndon B. Johnson, made explosive claims. They alleged that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had launched entirely unprovoked attacks against U.S. naval destroyers. These American warships were, it was claimed, peacefully operating in international waters when targeted. This event was immediately framed and presented to the American public as a clear act of naked aggression. President Johnson skillfully seized upon these dramatic claims to galvanize public and congressional support. He sought backing for a much wider, more aggressive military intervention in Vietnam. He needed a pretext for war. However, the reality of the Tonkin events was considerably murkier and far more complex. The first reported attack on the USS Maddox on August 2nd was itself deeply intertwined with US provocations. The Maddox was not merely on a routine patrol, it was conducting an electronic intelligence mission. This was known as a De Soto patrol. It operated in waters very close to the North Vietnamese coast, a sensitive area. Simultaneously, covert US-backed South Vietnamese commando raids under O-Plan 34A were actively targeting North Vietnamese coastal installations. The second alleged attack, supposedly occurring on August 4th against the Maddox and USS Turner Joy, very likely never happened at all. Subsequent analysis strongly suggests misinterpretations of radar and sonar signals. These were exacerbated by stormy weather conditions and jittery, inexperienced crews. In response to these highly dubious claims, the US Congress swiftly passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This resolution granted President Johnson exceptionally broad, almost unchecked authority. He could escalate American military involvement in Vietnam to any level he deemed necessary. Crucially, this was achieved without the constitutional requirement of a formal declaration of war from Congress. The resolution, therefore, was predicated on misleading, incomplete, and arguably deliberately false information. This information was provided by the executive branch to a willing legislature. The American public was fed a simplistic binary story, an unprovoked attack met by a justified defensive response. The complex, uncomfortable truths were systematically suppressed and hidden from view. The consequences stemming from this foundational deception were nothing short of catastrophic for all involved. The Vietnam War escalated dramatically. It transformed from a limited advisory role into a full-scale, brutal conflict. Millions of Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians tragically lost their lives in the ensuing carnage. Over 58,000 American soldiers also perished, with many more wounded physically and psychologically. The war deeply divided American society, creating bitter fissures that lasted for decades. It also starkly exposed the credibility gap between the pronouncements of the government and the grim reality on the ground. The Tonkin incident was, in essence, a foundational lie. It was a manufactured crisis that fueled a decade of horrific, unnecessary warfare. Moving forward in history to the 1980s, we observe a similar pattern of deception. The Reagan administration aggressively targeted the small nation of Nicaragua. The leftist Sandinista government, which had overthrown the US-backed Somoza dictatorship, was relentlessly portrayed as a grave and imminent threat. It was depicted as a danger not only to its neighbors, but to vital US interests throughout Central America. Persistent, alarming claims were made about supposed Soviet and Cuban communist influence dominating the Sandinistas. Nicaragua, officials asserted, was actively exporting violent revolution across the region. It was described as a domino poised to fall, threatening US security. A pervasive narrative of impending danger and communist expansion was meticulously constructed. This narrative was then widely disseminated. This served as the justification for sustained US interventionist policies. Intelligence information was systematically manipulated and distorted to bolster this predetermined hostile narrative. The actual threat posed by Nicaragua, a small and impoverished nation, was often grossly exaggerated to an absurd degree. The Contras, a disparate group of anti-Sandinista rebels, received substantial funding and weaponry from the United States. Much of this support was provided covertly. In many instances, it was illegal, circumventing congressional restrictions such as the Boland Amendment. The Reagan administration consistently portrayed the Contras as freedom fighters. They were even lauded as the moral equivalent of the Founding Fathers. Meanwhile, the well-documented human rights abuses and atrocities committed by these US-backed Contra forces were routinely downplayed, excused, or simply ignored by officials and much of the compliant media. The overarching aim was the destabilization and ultimate overthrow of the Nicaraguan government. Decades later, an eerily similar and tragically consequential pattern of deception emerged in the case of Iraq. The protracted lead-up to the March 2003 invasion was meticulously built upon a foundation of demonstrably false claims. The primary and most emotive justification offered was that Saddam Hussein's regime possessed vast stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. These WMDs, it was repeatedly asserted by top US and British officials, posed an immediate and intolerable threat to global security. Furthermore, persistent but unsubstantiated links were alleged between secular Ba'athist Iraq and the religious extremist group Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda were the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks. These alarming assertions were repeated relentlessly by leaders and officials. They formed a powerful echo chamber. This was amplified by a largely compliant and unquestioning mainstream media establishment. Following the invasion and occupation of Iraq, no significant WMD stockpiles were ever discovered. The intelligence, as many insiders later admitted, had not driven the policy. Rather, it had been fixed around the pre-existing policy to invade and remove Saddam Hussein. The supposed connection between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda was revealed to be tenuous at best. Many considered it entirely fabricated for propaganda purposes. The global public, particularly in the coalition countries, had been deliberately and systematically misled. They were manipulated into supporting a war of aggression, a clear violation of international law. The invasion led to immense and ongoing human suffering. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died and millions were displaced. The entire Middle East region was plunged into further chaos and sectarian violence. This, in turn, fueled the rise of new extremist groups like ISIS. The bitter legacy of this profound deception continues to unfold today. History, when honestly examined, teaches a consistently harsh and uncomfortable lesson about power. Governments, particularly powerful ones, will readily manipulate intelligence information. They engage in this practice to achieve their predetermined war aims and strategic objectives. The examples supporting this grim conclusion are numerous, consistent and deeply troubling. From the jungles of Vietnam to the hills of Nicaragua and onto the deserts of Iraq. The playbook employed by state propagandists is remarkably similar across time and geography. Fear is systematically stoked among the populace using national security rhetoric. Evidence is carefully distorted, selectively presented, or sometimes entirely invented to fit the narrative. Dissenting voices and critical perspectives are marginalized, ridiculed, or aggressively silenced. The mainstream media too often fails in its fundamental democratic duty. It fails to rigorously scrutinize and challenge official power, instead acting as a stenographer. The underlying motivations behind such pervasive deceptions are varied and often interlinked. The pursuit of geopolitical dominance and global hegemony clearly plays a significant role. Access to and control over vital natural resources, particularly oil, is frequently a major factor in these calculations. The immense profits generated by the sprawling military-industrial complex provide a powerful, ongoing incentive for conflict. This complex thrives on war and the preparation for war. Ideological crusades, often framed as simplistic battles between good and evil, also serve to drive these destructive actions. Whatever the specific combination of reasons in each instance, the tragic result is invariably the same. War is initiated and waged on a carefully constructed foundation of lies and half-truths. The ordinary public in all countries involved ultimately bears the terrible cost. They pay in blood, treasure, and lost opportunities. Therefore, cultivating a healthy sense of skepticism is not an expression of unthinking cynicism. It is, in fact, a vital and indispensable civic duty in any society that claims to be democratic. Citizens must learn to critically examine all official claims and pronouncements. This is especially true for those extraordinary claims that are used to justify the immense act of going to war. We must consistently demand verifiable evidence, not just assertions from figures of authority. We must rigorously question the sources of information and their potential biases and vested interests. We must actively seek out and support genuinely independent journalism. This is journalism that bravely challenges power rather than obediently serving its interests. Holding power to account is absolutely essential for the preservation of peace, justice, and democratic integrity. Unwavering vigilance remains our most potent defense against such manipulation by the powerful. We must diligently remember the deceptions of the past, for they illuminate the present. This historical awareness helps us to recognize the familiar tactics when they are inevitably deployed again. Understanding the mechanisms by which intelligence can be twisted, politicized, and weaponized is crucial. It helps to inoculate us against future attempts at manipulation and control by state and corporate interests. Ultimately, sustainable peace requires an unwavering commitment to truth and transparency. Exposing the lies that lead to war is a fundamental step towards building a more just and peaceful world. The price of unquestioning credulity as history repeatedly and painfully shows, is far too high. It is consistently paid in human blood, environmental destruction and squandered national treasure.